my mom's like, you got to call. And I'm like, oh, I'm like, okay. So I go upstairs. Um, I have someone there, or there's a recruiter on the phone. And he's like, hey, is this Mark Spina? I'm like, yes. He's like, yeah, so we have this potential job. Do you know HTML? And in my head, I'm like, yeah. Or I said, yeah. In my head, I thought, yeah, I took a class once, it's was years ago, but I can learn something. And he's like, do you know Ruby on Rails? And I was like, yeah. And I have no idea. I've never done Ruby on Rails. My hope was to I was like, okay, I'll prep for this interview. I'll like get on the ground floor, it'll be fine. And then the guy told me, he's like, okay, you start on Monday. And I was like, what? I'm like, oh, this is not good. Yeah. So Mark Spina, I am a senior front end engineer at Glassdoor. So the way I describe it in the non-fancy way is basically I just take data that back end people give me and just make it look pretty so people can like understand and actually be able to use it. Um, and yeah, it's kind of the main gist of it on my end.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely dive into like what is back end, what is front end, a little bit later. Um, we like to start from the kind of the very beginning. Software engineering. Is this something that you wanted to do ever since you were a kid? Did it exist back then? Do you know, as a career path when you were little?
I I've had a very eclectic like desire for what I wanted to be. Like I remember one of my they or as a kid playing make believe type stuff, I wanted to be a record executive at one point. So I wouldn't say software engineer was the first thing that happened, but I always was kind of like bouncing around between different things and then I started worrying about what I was going to do in high school when, college was approaching and I'm like, oh shoot, I'm like, okay, I don't know what's out there. Um, and I wound up taking an elective class for computing, so software engineering. And I feel I had a very lucky experience with that because the teacher I had, he was like, "Oh, the way I'm gonna like show kids how to program is basically by teaching them how to make games." So that entire class was just like, "Oh, you were gonna make a solitaire type thing. We're gonna make like asteroids. We're gonna make brick break." Uh, so I kept going with that. Took it the next year because I had so much fun the first year, and then I was like, all right, this is kind of what I want to do. So I wound up going to school for game design and development originally, and I went from Southern California to Rochester, New York for that purpose, um, and did 4 years of that, and still like really enjoyed the creative aspect. Not as solid on the I'd say heavier software engineering stuff, like the back end number manipulation and data storage type thing. But I can make it look good and interact well.
Well, when you said you were you didn't, or when you got stressed over what career path to take, is that something that you had a discussion with your friends, especially in high school? Did anyone talk about software engineering, or was it just the teacher that sort of gave you that background? And then what were the careers that were in your purview at that time that made you stress over that?
Yeah, so I'd say with other than just kind of like general high school like anxiety about what's going next, I didn't really communicate with my friends as much, and I think part of that was a good amount were just already like, okay, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna go to the local community college and then, figure out from there. Roll the dice type thing. And so it was really lucky that I just wound up taking that class on a whim. Um, and at that time, I was really unsure. I was like, okay, well, I like history, so maybe I'll do something with like that. And I'm like, okay, well, a lot of that winds up going into law, so am I going to be a lawyer? But I don't know if that fits my personality because I'm not a big one for arguments on that front. Um, Same with like, I know doctors are out there, so I was like, oh, maybe I'll be like a doctor. I'm like, but that's not really sparking anything in me. Um, so it was really, I I joke with my friends that if we all had like gaming stats type thing, my luck would be really high. And this is just another example of one of them where it's like, all right, took a class, wound up being the right class to take.
Yeah, so it sounded like the options in your mind were pretty limited in terms of career paths. Like, is was there just no one talking to you about it? Was like the school guidance counselors, parents, it was just all on you? What-
i yeah, I'd say effectively. I know like one time in ninth grade, we like they ushered us into like the kind of the computer lab, and they're like, okay, take a test. And we all just filled it, and it was some like basic program that's like your your aptitude suggests veterinarian type thing. Um, and it just felt very, I guess, like large boxes, which that's been a thing I've realized over time is that it's like I keep thinking these careers or these massive like doctor, but then you can like start going into it, or like software engineer, and it's like okay, but you have front end, you have back, and you have like data scientists, you have like all these additional things, um, which can be more interesting than the original, um, I guess, giant box where it's like, oh, I don't care for this, but the interior stuff actually is interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you were in high school, did you have any jobs? Were you in sports? Were you in any clubs that might have been, exposed you to other things?
So I would say I was pretty shy as a kid. I was involved in wrestling, um, so that was different, I'll say. Um, but I also, a couple summers, my grandfather managed this lumber mill, so went up there, helped a few times. Never was allowed near the chemicals or the saws, though. I think he pulled some strings on that front to be like, all right, we're not letting him get to anything too dangerous in that regard.
Yeah. Do you think that a lot of people are sort of, you know, insular from outside career paths when they're at your they were at your age? Do you think a lot of people kind of struggle with what they wanted to do? Uh, I know you were sort of more on the introverted side and didn't talk to your friends about it, but based on what you heard from people, do you think that that was the case for a lot of people, or did some people just know what they want?
I feel like some people definitely like key into something, where it's like, okay, this is the thing I want to go to. It's like I grow up, I want to be like I had an ex-girlfriend who knew she wanted to be a surgeon. She's a surgeon, just like kept going down that path. But I think most people are more eclectic, where it's like, there's certain things that interest you, and then it's like that can change once you get more into it, or it could not be interesting at first, but then once you start diving into it, you start wanting to investigate more. Um, there's a quote, I forget who it's by, but it basically said specializations for insects, where it's kind of the whole, we have this life to live, so let's, try out all these different things. And I think very few people get to know like, oh yes, I want to do this for the rest of my life for like, 40, 50 plus years.
I completely agree with that. Um, I I think I'm a victim to that where I've been jumping around all over the place too. So so that resonates with me. For so once you went to college, did you immediately start going down a computer science path then, or what was your major in college?
Yeah, so I went for game design and development because I mean, I think part of it was, also being a kid. I'm like, hey, I really want to make this. Um, and one of the things that the director of the program like made sure to like drill into people from the very beginning was this isn't we're just sitting here playing games. It's like we're actually like doing work here. And a big part of it was the school really liked having people career prepared. So they really emphasized the programming aspect of uh, game design and development because they're like, okay, um, even if you can't find a job quite in the industry, you can um, find something. So we had like some elective classes additionally, like HTML, which now that I do it all the time, it's kind of funny. That's like at the time I barely remember doing much, and I was like, oh, I'll just get this done really quick. Um, but yeah, I've worked with computers ever since I went to college. So
What's the difference between software engineering and I guess gaming design then? I figured they might have been hand in hand in some way, but it sounds like it's not. So could you go into detail a little bit there?
yeah, I think it's really just like the game design version is just more. It's just a specialized one. So it's like again with the buckets type thing, where it's like, okay, here's software engineering as a whole, and now it's like, okay, now you're focusing on games. So you have like different concerns where if you're building a website, it's like there's certain performance things you care about versus like when you're building a game where graphics become like a big thing, like um, thinking of like PS5 and whatnot, where it's like okay, we need to make this look good and run well, so you have to like really be key on performance. Whereas a more static, I guess, modern web page, you're able to be needs to be snappy and quick, but you're not worrying about the same like okay, this is the massive character model we're showing up here.
When it comes to like the programming languages, are they similar then? Do they use the same languages, I guess? I don't know anything about software development, so feel free to feel free to go in detail and act, explain to me as I'm a kid.
Yeah, so I'd say in terms of programming languages, a lot of stuff, the idea behind stuff is very similar, where it's like, okay, you have something for numbers, and this, you have a variable and it's storing items. And then depending on the language, it can be like very specific, where it's like, okay, this variable can only store numbers. Or JavaScript, which is the main one I work with, can also can basically ignore that and be like, okay, this variable can literally store anything. Um, it's like you want it to store a word here and a number here, you go for it. I program or the language doesn't care. Uh, most things at this point are kind of moving more towards the former, where it's like, okay, if we have a number, we want to know it's a number no matter where we see it. Um, so I'd say concepts are the same. It's just like each one has fancy little tweaks here and there, like fun things it can do. Um, so in game design, you have a lot of it use, at least when I was learning, uses C++. So an older language, and it would have things like pointers. So you'd go through the code, you'd reach a line, it's like, okay, this one now go over here, as opposed to so you could have multiple things running at the same time, and our JavaScript typically just like goes uh, like downline. So it's like you're not just randomly going to different places. It's kind of easier to go or read logically, I'd say.
Yeah. Is it when you were in school, do they just teach you some fundamentals about the languages? Do they teach you multiple languages, or do they just teach you one and then go, you can learn others based upon the foundation that you have from one? Because specifically you were doing gaming. I'm curious how that translates over to, the web development that you're doing now.
Yeah, so a lot of that is definitely like fundamentals. So I learned on Java, which our backend engineers at the company still use, and then it's like I was able to like tweak it as needed to JavaScript with the I guess just learning the fun little quirks about what makes it a little different. Um, so they definitely focused on a language for that, and they're like, okay, you get one down, you can start like learning more. I think of it kind of like the Romance languages, where it's like if you know like French, you have like an idea of how Spanish can like start flowing, and same with Italian. But also like those languages, you can't like fully assume everything works the exact same way, because then it's like you'll trip up and um but it's enough to like when you start learning it, it's helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. In college, then, can you like tell us a little bit about that experience? Were you actually building real games that ultimately came out, or how did that work?
Yeah, so there were a few that I worked on, nothing that anyone would ever know. um but one of the big things we had was co-ops, basically just making sure they were paid internships. Like we had to do a few of them to graduate. So the first one I did, it was a combination of our business school and our computing school, and it was a typing game. So we just made this like typing RPG, uh, where it's like, you know, depending on how fast you typed and how accurately, determined like how strong like a spell would be if you casted it. Um, so that was a little thing. One of my favorite parts of that was, and it seems so kind of silly now, but it was a big accomplishment for me. Was just this like land generation algorithm. It was like, okay, I get a sheet of ones and zeros. Now I need to make like piece all the land. If it's a one, it's a solid piece. But now I need to like have the in between. So if it's like piece by piece, it needs to kind of be like curved there. Otherwise, you just have like giant blocks of terrain and just kind of silly. But the I think that aha moment was just one of those things that is one of my favorite parts of the job in computing in general, because it feels kind of like a puzzle where it's like, okay, how do I solve this thing? There's an answer somewhere. I know it's possible, and then just like mulling it over and be like, oh, this makes so much sense. Um, and then the other game that I really like making was, and I've like gone back to this idea a couple times since, is you know how Pokemon Go has you like go around different places and like collect things? The idea was a similar RPG where it was like, okay, you cut the world into like slices, and then each slice is a different biome. So it's like, okay, you go here, you can get desert equipment. You go here, you could get forest equipment. Um, so doing that, and then having kind of, I guess, like special events that could take place at set key coordinates. So it's like a big thing that me and the group I worked with was, we were adding was, um, we all lived across different parts of the country. So like, okay, well, anyone who's at this spot, can fight a special boss, which was each of us. So
Um, what made you pick the computer? I mean, the gaming um major, I guess. Was it because of your interest in playing video games? Is that still was that a very, very big part of your life? And then that's what sort of made you want to go down that path?
yeah, so on that, it was definitely a combination. I think that's probably what started the entire path in the first place. Was like I said, I was shy. I just played a lot of games, um, and then that's what like took me to that class. I think in that first place. Then I'm like, okay, this is fun. I could see doing this. Similarly, I my best friend also wound up he played a ton of games as well, and he took the same class, and we both had like really fond memories of the teacher. Um, I guess I was just the one who could put up with more of the math than he could.
Yeah, is it super math intensive then? If someone's getting into this industry, do you think that they would need to have a very strong math background, or is that something that they can get through with, some of the more basic, like arithmetic and maybe some basic calculus and algebra?
Yeah, yeah. Say it depends. I know with gaming, it's like especially once you're working in like 3D space, it's like nicer to have higher math. Um, for front end, like my current day job, not so much. Um, I there were some fancy math classes I took in college, but to start everything and like what I usually do, it's like I never took calculus or pre-calc. It's like the highest I went to was like algebra 2, and then I had like analytical geometry was a thing in college, but that was for 3D space. So stuff I had not touched, and if I look at those notes now, I'd probably be like, man, I was really smart back then.
Okay. And then I guess once you graduated college, what was your degree in? Was it in computer science, or was it in a software? I mean, gaming development. Is that a major?
Yeah, so that was actually one of my favorite things about it. So at the time, I know there were a lot of schools that had like computer science and then like kind of like a focus on game design development. But at the time, I think mine was one of two schools that actually offered like a degree in game design and development. So officially, it's like Bachelor of Science in Game Design and Development. So that was kind of a fun thing to have from style points.
Yeah, I might be a little bit older, but I'd never known that that was like a major. Definitely did exist. I don't think when I was going to school, at least not my school. Did did um did a lot of the classes overlap between computer science and also the game development majors then?
There was some for some of the, I'd say, more advanced parts. Our foundational classes, I think the coding was the same, but we also had our design aspects to focus on as well. So they were kind of kept separate. But once we started getting like further along, where it's like if you want to take a, I'm trying to think, like an AI course or um, I guess some of the fancy like optimization type things, um, or we even had you could focus more on like um, code that I guess like network code. So it's like make sure how the computers connect to each other. Um, that was definitely able to be shared.
Okay. You said that you mentioned a little bit about the design stuff. Where did you have to, design the graphics while you were in these courses? Is that did you have to have an artistic abilities then for that for the game development side?
So you didn't have to have it. I guess part of it was if you wanted to, you could. Otherwise, a lot of it was group projects, which was very helpful. Um, I like being creative, but I can't draw. So my things would look pretty bad if I was the one to do them. So I'd kind of work alongside someone who could really like make something more design wise, and then I'd provide more like the structure for it and how it's like actually going to operate.
Were a lot of the classes group dynamics then, or were there a lot of independent projects that you would have to work on in order to prove out the skill sets that you had within, different programming languages, or just the technical stuff that you needed to know as a foundation?
Most of them were group projects. There were definitely like some classes, like I took an elective to do uh, music one, like get music into games. Um, that one went fine, but all my stuff sounded the exact same because I'm like, this sounds good. And I'm like, I call it Crystal Cave. This one's Crystal Lake. Uh, but and other ones where it's like if they did need to know if you got the concept, then it would be more solo work. So we had to take two data algorithm courses and just data structures and algorithms. So it's like, okay, we want to make sure you can like do the math and you understand if a billiard ball like collides at this point, the right way to apply this force and um, the direction of if you have all these like little items. Um, it was like a swarm test where it was like, okay, you have all these like individual circles in one circle, and like how does the entire group move? So it's like depending on different levers. So it's like, okay, if you make them want more space, then they go out, you know, they separate a little further. But now if it hits a wall, then it's like this one comes back a little. So now all these go down. Um, so yeah, if it was something they really want to make sure, it would be more of a uh, individual. But if it's more like, okay, this is like kind of how a project works, which looking back is actually kind of nice now that it's what I do day to day where I'm working in these projects. And I think going into college, I was definitely more like, oh, I'll just do it by myself. It's fine. So it's kind of nice to be forced into that, even if at the time I didn't appreciate it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that there was so much um, group work when it comes to like college courses and software development. I always just assumed that it was about individual skill sets, right? Like, can you do HTML? Can you do Java, and program almost independently? That's what I thought it was. So that's fascinating. I guess moving forward, after you graduated college, did you go straight into a gaming company then, or what happened next?
So the question was basically, oh, if I went straight to like industry. So I did not. I remember graduating, and for like 6 months, I was trying to find something, and then I was actually downstairs, like in my family's garage, and they'd recently moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and my mom's like, "You got to call," and I'm like, "Oh," I'm like, "Okay." So I go upstairs. Um, I have someone there, or there's a recruiter on the phone, and he's like, "Hey, is this Mark Spina?" I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "Yeah, so we have this potential job. Do you know HTML?" And in my head, I'm like, "Yeah," or I said, "Yeah." In my head, I thought, "Yeah, I took a class once. It's was years ago, but I can learn something." And he's like, "Do you know Ruby on Rails?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I have no idea. I've never done Ruby on Rails. My hope was to I was like, okay, I'll prep for this interview. I'll like get on the ground floor, it'll be fine. And then the guy told me, he's like, okay, you start on Monday. And I was like, what? I'm like, oh, this is not good. So that
Yeah.
entire
How did that recruiter even find you?
so I because like a distant cousin of mine. She was working for a recruiting agency. So by giving her my name, they put like my name in in their database, and then they just happened to draw mine as the one for this team that was starting up.
That's crazy. Okay, yeah. So it was just it wasn't a gaming company, right? It
Nope.
was a software develop like what was that? Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. Like jumping into a company where you don't actually know the language that they're building it with.
The plus side was the recruiter also really didn't know. I don't think the team knew at the time, but yeah, after that phone call, I started like studying up like that entire like week. I think it was a Wednesday. I got the call, so that entire like until Monday, I was like brushing up and like, oh, this is my first like professional job. Like all anxious, and then I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. So I get there, they're spinning up this team. So the first company I worked for is the same one I'm working at now, Glassdoor. And what wound up happening was we were they needed a way to like get jobs from other sites still. So it's like if a company, let's say like Kellogg's, just they have their job openings on their webpage. Um, it was our responsibility as the aggregation team to like kind of go there. We had an internal tool to like just grab what we needed, and be like, okay, here's the jobs. Now you can see them on our site. We'll redirect back to their site as needed. Um, so it was actually originally a trial run, um, and I was one of two. The other person being the recruiter's friend. So it's like really one available spot, which I'm taking. I'm like, okay, we'll see how this like works out. Worked out well enough. Within 2-ish weeks, I want to say they hired two more. 2 weeks hired two more, and then 2 weeks, I want to say hired another two. So it's like quickly the team quickly rose, and I think at this point it's been 8 years since that team originally started. Um, and everyone on that team's now like doing other stuff. It's like now we have someone doing software engineering and testing, and we have others doing more like back end. We have me doing front end. So it's like kind of it was a good entry point. It didn't require if you didn't want it to. It didn't require much effort to like just kind of like click these things. But I think that's where everyone started separating themselves. Was like, okay, you can do this, but what else are you going to do on top of it? And my grandmother really, she still remembers when I came home and I was like tweaking the internal tool because I was like, yeah, my finger just hurts from like all this clicking. So I was like, I'm gonna make it so I don't have to do that anymore. So it's like just fidgeting around with things. Um, so then I went from there. We were working hand in hand with our like jobs team in general, and me and another team member at the time were offered like to go work with them. So like, okay, we'll go. And they're working on this fancy feature, which wound up dying out, but had a front end part and a back end part. And they're like, okay, well, you guys, we don't have time to work on this, so you guys can do this. Who wants to do what? And me and the guy looked at each other. Oh, I don't care. What do you want to do? Oh, I don't care. And then he's like, well, I guess I'll do back end. And in my head, I'm like, oh, thank you, because I'm like, I didn't want to do that.
Could you explain a little bit about the difference between front end and back end?
Yeah. So front end is basically if you go to a website, it's all the parts you're interacting with. So it's what you can see. It's a position that it's kind of like the end of everything, where it's like, okay, we had a product vision, they made a design for it, um, and so we create that, and then back end, which is like like getting the data, manipulating it as needed, storing it. They give that to the front end, and then that's what displays. So, for instance, if you went to a page and it's like, enter a username and password. So everything you'd see on there was made by a front end engineer. As soon as you hit like save, the front end would then take the new username and the password, send it to the back end. The back end does what they do, where it's like, okay, we can encrypt this to make sure it's safe. We'll store it here. Um, and then if you go back on later to like log in, and then you enter your username and password, it would then go back to the back end, check, verify that that is the correct thing. Comes back to the front end. It's like, okay, cool, you can move forward, and then we take you to the next page.
Okay. What was your reservation uh, when it came to doing the back end then? Is there do some people would prefer one over the other?
Yeah, I definitely think people do have a preference. I like being able to see what I can do. It makes me feel better. Also, having like some creativity, some more creative input, where it's like we work pretty closely with designers, where it's like, okay, they're like, okay, I want this to look like this, and then on our end, it's like, oh, okay, that's easy, or it's like, oh, well, it looks kind of funky, or maybe users would interact with it differently. Um, like we've had ideas before that it's like bounce back and forth between front end and design for that reason, where it's like, okay, it's like this is doable, but should we do it? Um, and then on the back end side, I think it's just more technical from all my experiences with it. I did it for a bit, and I just remember my head just getting lost. So, but I think in a way too, it's like a kind of can be more stable. Front end historically has had like it's kind of the newer one, and as a result, it's like had a lot of changes. Like there was a saying where it's like every 6 months you have to relearn everything front end wise because it's like there's this new paradigm. It's like, "Wait, we're doing this, we're doing that." Um, like a big thing now is like there's a library out there called React, and it's really nice. It was a lot better than what we started with. Um, but the issue is like you can still like have some uh, obscure items. So now there's a whole push to TypeScript. So it's like another thing we're like all going through and updating. Whereas most of our back end winds up being like, okay, it's this level. Now we need to update it to this, but it's more of a over time, slowly, not as quick to shake up. So I guess a bit more stable.
Okay. When you first walked into that job, then, what was that like to be onboarded into the team? And, what were the dynamics that you had to learn about a company and then your role, who your supervisor was? What was that like? And then, yeah, I'll follow up later with how did you go about learning Ruby on Rails if you didn't know. I'll follow up with that one.
So yeah, when I started, it's one of those things where you hear about like Bay Area, like tech in general, like different kind of culture. And I wasn't sure how much is like, like clickbait articles and like how much is like truth. So I like kind of went for in between at first, where it's like semi-formal. Where it's like, okay, I'll wear like a nice button up, but I'll also wear pants. And then we used to have an old site architect, which is way up there on our front end side, who just one day wore the craziest outfit, and I'm like, okay, I can see now that I can pretty much wear what I want as long as the work's done. Um, so I definitely enjoy tech being more laid back. Um, and I also wound up going, at one point I did switch companies for like 6 months. Um, and it was very similar atmosphere where it's like, okay, we care about things getting accomplished. It's everything else is like, all right, whatever. We don't have, we're not worrying about you just like sitting here for like 8 hours, right in that seat. It's more like, okay, is this thing done? Sweet. Then I I enjoy that because in my head I'm like, what's the why would you do otherwise? It's like you have a thing you want done, and that's kind of the trade-off. It's like you paid me, I make you things. It works out pretty well.
So once you walk in, during the onboarding, like as a, let's say, a first day or first week on the job, uh, what are you learning there? Or do you immediately start producing?
So on that team, I would say it was very. I think we had like half a day to kind of like learn the tools, and then it was like, okay, now you can go. It was. I will say it was like very simple, but from another side, I do know with like now when we hire like associates and whatnot, we expect them to like, have a decent grasp of what's going on. We've had few interns like over the years like come through and within a day or so, um, I'll say within the first week, just because there's is fun stuff like once you have to like get a computer set up and then dealing with that where it's like it can be a little tricky with all the like fancy like, oh, here's a VPN, here's this, here's that. But once all that's settled, I'd say it's like a day or so to like start doing something. But usually it's very like I'd say smaller. So I'd be like, okay, there's this little issue you got to fix, and it's a thing that's very similar, and it kind of gives you a scope of the um, how the project's laid out. So if you're opening up different files and stuff, it's like, okay, this is going to be located here, this is going to be located there. And then as you become more familiar with that, then it's like, you know, more gets placed on your plate at that point.
Okay. And you said you didn't know Ruby on Rails. Were they actually building off of that? And then how were you able to day one just start, you know, after the initial week, of course?
Oh yeah, like they did not, when they made this team, they kind of just threw out what they thought they might need. Never touched Ruby on Rails. If I didn't want to, I could have in theory never touched any code um, for this first one because it was like an internal tool and it was just like very just manual. Um, so never had to learn Ruby on Rails despite having been asked like by them and also like the career fairs in college and stuff are like, oh, Ruby on Rails. Um, like I'm not even sure what the status on that is currently, like just Ruby on Rails in general.
Yeah, I haven't heard that in probably 6, 7 years. So yeah, so okay, that's good. That's great. I can understand why you said earlier that you on the luck scale it's very high.
Yeah.
So from like a day-to-day perspective now, what's it like to be a front-end engineer?
Yeah, I'd say the majority of days, it's, I guess if, in a way, can I I'll break it up more into like a week or so, just because different things happen different days. So um, there'll be like a grooming meeting where it's like, okay, we're all going to here's what we want to accomplish this in these next 2 weeks in the sprint, and once that's like done, It's like, okay, cool. Every morning, effectively, I check out our board to be like, okay, what am I working on? What do have? Or it's like if I finished the stuff I wanted to accomplish the day before, then it's like, okay, what am I starting today? Um, and then most of it is me creating things in general. So it's mostly coding. As I've gone up, more meetings creep in, but I think that's kind of the beast for everything as you go, as you get more experience. It's like, okay, now you're involved in more meetings. Now you gotta help start planning things and um, giving more insight into it. Whereas in the beginning, it's a lot more like, okay, here's a task, do it. Here's a task, do it. Now it's like, okay, we want to accomplish this. What do your insights provide? Like it's like, is this reasonable? Is the time frame good? Do you have any opinions on how this looks or how this interacts? Um, but the majority of the time, it's like just doing different types of code. So within the past month, it's like, okay, building this. Um, we're working on some new pages, so building components and new items for that. We're also upgrading some things, so it's like going back and doing some tech debt, where it's like, okay, this is stuff we missed previously, or we decided we didn't want to work on at that time as we were trying to do something else. So now it's time to go back and fix that, which is what the holidays wind up being a ton of. Um, and then, uh, yeah, and interacting with design on certain tickets if I need to interact with design, talking with backend for the same, where it's like, okay, I have this thing, I have the data, it's all ready. I just need to connect with you to pass in the right items.
Could you walk us through a little bit about the team dynamic that you work in? So you said you were senior front end
Mhm.
engineer. What do the more junior ones do? Is there, who's above you, and what is that? What are all the roles, and how do they interact?
Yeah, we have. I think it's interesting because there's kind of two teams wind up being a part of. There's my day-to-day team, which has our team lead. We have a senior backend engineer and another backend engineer, and then me and our other front-end engineer was just recently promoted, also senior. So there's two of us that take care of that. We also have a software developer for testing. So he basically just goes through and makes sure all the code's working right and how we expect. Um, and then we have designers that work with our team. They kind of go between a couple teams. Um, but as we keep making things, they just give us the stuff to start implementing. And a product manager. So the one who's kind of the guiding force on what we're making. So the team as a whole, I would say, is between the product manager and the team lead, where team lead being the more technical one, who's like, okay, this is what we can do. Here's our input, or uh, here's what we can do. Here's the timeline we're looking at. And then product, who's like, okay, I've talked with them. Here's what I'm committing to for the company. The company wants us to have this. Um, so it's kind of a back and forth. And then as a senior, I'd say we give more input to the team lead as a result and product. Where it's they're basically ask us okay, what are your thoughts? Um, when I was a more junior member, when I was an associate, which is the lowest you can start as, it was just kind of okay, here's tasks, accomplish them. And then when I was regular, it was interspersed, I'd say. It depended on the team because I've shuffled teams a few times as we've had reorgs and whatnot. So it's if we didn't have a front end engineer, it's okay, then I'd be the main point of contact on that. Otherwise, if there was a senior or a lead, then it's they typically were the ones that defaulted to. And then we also have outside of that, um, we have our, I'd say, just like front end leadership. So where it's like all of us in front end, how we interact. So you have like associates, regular, senior, leads above that, and then you have the top, which is our like site architect. So he's kind of like responsible for how everything should operate as a whole. So that it winds up being a lot more, I guess, like the foundations of how we're making it. So earlier I mentioned like React libraries. Okay, I'm making things and let's put on here. But it's like, okay, how do we make sure this gets displayed right? Make sure it's like the most performant. Um, what's the scaffolding, I'd say. So we have like Node moving to this thing called Next.js. Uh, so I guess just kind of being that whole, if you had components first, which is like, tiny little things you make, then you start making pages, then you make like whole applications, and then it's like, okay, how do you like build out these applications? Um, and pretty much, I think you start focusing on, that's kind of like the way you start focusing on as you like keep going up. um, from small to being like, okay, what's the big picture now? Like, how do I make all of these web apps run correctly?
Can you describe a little bit what you mean by those libraries?
Yeah. So we have, like, right now we're using a lot, most of our stuff's Node, and that is responsible for like how we're serving up our pages and um, so how we're serving up our pages and how it's like all taken care of. So once we put the our site on a server. Like once we put this thing there, that's how it knows how to operate. Um, so I'm trying to think of the easiest way to. I think that's how I've always generally viewed it. It's kind of like, okay, once we have this library, it's on the server. Now we need to make sure it's like when you go to like a certain URL, that it's like, it redirects you to the right place. And then once you're there, um, like how that we start serving up the right code, I'd say.
So when you're given like a task, um, are you going from scratch or do you draw from these libraries? Is that what the use of these libraries are for?
So I'd say it depends on the library. We have a lot that are um, like most of our web applications are like there's a lot of stuff that we just if you see it, we've made it. So it's like we have our own repos where it's like, okay, here's what our buttons look like, here's our design system. But then there's items where it's like, okay, well, I don't want to remake a let's say a form. So it's like, okay, we're now calling this like other library, and be like, okay, now we'll use their form, we'll just style it how we need it to.
Okay, got it. That makes a lot of sense. So there is still a lot that you're building specifically for your company. Um, and then, uh, so how would someone go about getting this job? If it was a let's start with students, and then we can work our way up to maybe like a mid-career transition.
Yeah,
So if it was a student, uh, how would you recommend them going into the field?
I would say if you can, like internships, co-ops, like a lot of companies are doing that. Um, and we've had a lot of success on our end. Like we've hired a lot of the people we previously had as interns. That's probably the easiest way. Um, I know that we've also hired a lot of people who've like done well at boot camps, but the caveat being it's like not just being able to like recite a answer. being more like, okay, taking the concepts and really being able to like flesh it out. Because one of the first things is always a technical test, and I'll be like, okay, how can you make this thing? And it's pretty easy to suss out the people who know how to like actually make it versus the people who have like learned a very specific way. So like understanding the concept versus just being able to like regurgitate. Um, so those would be certain ways.
When you said the internship, is
Mhm.
that an intern that comes from college, or are there high school internships that they can, pursue? Like, what level of internship do you mean?
Yeah, I feel like it's gonna depend on the company on that front. I remember a long time ago, went to the game developers conference in San Francisco. One of the like higher up engineers there was like pretty adamant that he liked people who like didn't have a college degree and could show their stuff versus people going through a program. Uh, I know that we have more of a foothold in our company in like colleges, like around. So it's probably easier on that front, but I don't think it should be I guess, like a hard wall to be like, no, don't try if you haven't done it. Because I think a thing I enjoy about tech and programming is I've had good experience and I've seen like a lot of good people like come um, through unconventional means, where it's like if you can prove that you know what you're doing, it doesn't matter like what you have if you have like this degree or it's like know this person. It's more like, okay, yeah, you can make this, you can go.
Okay. Then, so do you think that there'd be like 16-year-old interns then, like that were in high school, and then are there certain companies, you said maybe in the Silicon Valley, that or California, that might, be willing to and open for to accept interns that young? Or do you just mean that they had a high school, diploma, but didn't have a college degree yet?
So I think I would say the odds are that'd be harder for a 16-year-old with the, but I also wouldn't close the door um like on that front, because again, a lot of this can be a lot of the learnings you can do to like learn how to do this code are online. um and I think that's a kind of a common joke, is the whole part of being good at your job, like in tech, is knowing how to Google well. So it's like if you can like locate answers, that's a big skill set. So it's really just about like trying to, if you can understand the concepts, you might have a harder time the younger you are, just for that reason of being like, okay, unsure if we can do this. But there are definitely like some places out there that are willing to take that chance.
Do you think that building products maybe at a younger age to have a portfolio would be helpful, to showcase a skill set, as part of their resume when they're doing an application? Is that something that could be recommended?
Yeah, I think a portfolio definitely like helps open the door. Um, just for the reason to be like, okay, it's like here's what I've made. It's like you can like check this out, check that out. And a nice thing on front end side is because it's like literally what you see. Um, you can Someone could open up like the inspector on a console and just take a look at your code like right then and there and kind of get like a feel of how you work through things.
Oh yeah, that's great to know. I never even thought about that. That makes sense. Okay. Um, Yeah. So, what if they go for a degree route? What are the degrees that are relevant for this career field?
Yeah, I mean, any of the computing ones in general, I think can make the shift. They're for front end in particular, I don't really know if there's like a specific one. I feel like it's newer as a specialty in the sector as opposed to something more like back end focused where it's like, okay, here's computer science. Because it's like, okay, well, yes, it's like goes from there, goes from like software engineering, but it's like a very specific subset of that. Um, so, I mean, that doesn't hurt. Any logic type stuff, um, I think is always helpful with programming. So it's like math sciences, just kind of like the way understanding how things like flow down. Um, but I also think from if you have that and a bit of like that creative spark, um, it's helpful because then it's like, okay, now you know how things look, or you kind of have a feel where it's like, okay, this doesn't look quite right. Let me tweak this. Let me like add a little spacing or change the color by like a little bit.
That makes sense. Uh, you sort of detailed a way to get into the industry, so directly from a degree. What if it was someone that is mid-career and is interested in transitioning? You mentioned a little bit about the boot camp side. Um, how effective are those?
It definitely depends on the boot camp. Um, Again, going back, it's like if they teach you how to think of through the concepts versus just like, okay, this is the question they're going to ask you, just put this down. Um, it's if you can start understanding the concepts, it's definitely more helpful. We've had like a few like strong engineers, like another person promoted to senior this past cycle, started as a boot camp, and I think it's a nice thing about them is it kind of gives you some like quote unquote legitimacy before like applying. So it's not just like going through recruiting and then being the recruiter saying like, oh, you're in veterinarian sciences. It's like I don't know how this translates, but it's like, oh well, on the resume they have this like they did this boot camp, so I could see how um, they have the ability now, so I can like pass them through. So I think that would be the solid way. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations on how to evaluate one of these coding boot camps before someone takes it to understand how they teach? I don't know if you have any familiarity with it. If not, it's okay. But if you do, how might you be able to gauge, maybe talking to someone who's running the program, like how are you teaching this so that I understand concepts rather than regurgitation of, you know, the coding.
I think I don't have much personal experience, but I think it's kind of the same as you would when you're looking at schools or like when you're looking to like apply somewhere, where you kind of like see what people are saying and if you can get stats where it's like, okay, what's their like placement rate? And it's like, what did the people say about it? Um, and then usually it's like in some of the recruiting circles, it winds up being like the bad ones kind of get found out. Where it's like, oh, if they have like this name, it's like it's not really worth much.
Okay. What type of is there a personality type or that someone might be able to go, you know, what if they were in your shoes, in high school, not sure what they wanted to do with their life, right? Um, are there any indicators, that might point to, oh, I might actually enjoy, you know, being a software engineer? Um, you know, do you see any commonalities, or are there just crazy extroverts too. In there, it seems like there's a trend, right? Everyone likes the headsets, wears a hoodie, right? That seems to be the television stereotype. Do you see any type of like personality traits and trends that might indicate someone would be interested in this?
I think a big part of it's like I, a lot of the people I kind of imagine that I've worked with, I can really imagine just like really liking to read. And I think it's just being able to like sit with something for a while and like figure it out. Because we've had so many different types of people. Like we've had like some really extrovert, like I'm gonna talk to everyone, everyone knows their name. Um, people. We've had people who it's like, yeah, just headphones on in the corner. Maybe you can find them in the day, maybe get them to say a word. And you've had like kind of everyone in between. So I think it's a big part is just like liking to solve like problems. And then depending on how you like to solve them and like the end result kind of like determines your specialty. It's like I like to see it, so I want to be a front end as opposed to someone else who could be like, I want to like solve this problem. I want to figure out like how to like crunch these numbers like smaller, might lean more back and it's like, oh, I want to see if I can make this break. Might wind up being like a test engineer.
Do you think a good gauge for personal interest in it would be to just maybe go to one of these online free courses and just to attempt it and see if there's any level of interest? Do you think that that would be a good way to see if that's a possible career path, just from an interest standpoint?
Yeah, I definitely say it's like good to give it a whirl because I, again, in high school, I kind of went against it for the longest time because I'm like, people say I'd like it, so I'm like, I'm not gonna do it. And then I did it, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this is pretty cool. Um, and I know, like, I'd say the group, the kind of the cohort before me, a lot of them, like learned with MySpace. Where it's like, okay, here's we're making HTML changes, and then for some people, it's like, oh, they just copy pasted it. For other people, like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. I'll stick with this. Um, so I'd definitely say it's fun. You should give it a whirl, but also do it in a way that's interesting to you. Where if in high school that class I took wasn't like about games, if it was more like, okay, we're just like storing these tables here in the most efficient way, I don't know if I would have continued to be like, this is like a drag. I want to do something else, especially, teenager at that point. So it's like if something can, I guess, spark your interest and you think you want to like, see it or automate it or something like that, it's like definitely give it a spin.
That's that's really good advice, I think, because you're right. I think if if people look at it from a surface level, the coding itself might actually be, cumbersome and tedious. But if you knew the end result, like a video game
Hmm.
or something that you're actually interested in, yeah, I can see how you might actually find it interesting. So that's a great tip. Um,
One other thing,
yeah.
I'll throw in there really quick. Sorry. Um, I guess it's also, even if you wind up not necessarily caring to like program, it's definitely good. It can benefit in other ways. I have my best friend who's now like going for a PhD in biology, and he's gotten back into coding just because he's like, okay, I can now like make this calculator that no one else can make, and by having that background, it's been helping him. So it can make life easier, just knowing how to make the computer do things for you.
So you said they're pursuing a PhD in biology, and because of their background in coding, it makes their life easier as a. Do you see a lot of that parallels in a lot of other industries now? I'm assuming that there probably is, right? Like medicine and other things like programming isn't just an isolated like I'm going to make a website or a web app anymore. It's probably moving into basically every other industry.
Yeah, it can definitely like sync up and make just like life easier. Whereas before you might have had to like manually like do this, like having to write everything down, or it's like, oh, you have to remember all these like um calculations. Now you can just be like, okay, computer, do it for me. It's like become my calculator type thing. Because I forget the exact specifics, but it was he was previously having to like deal with all these very long like things, and then he's picked up another language, one that I haven't used, but similar again with all languages having like some overlap. Um, it's like, oh, okay, I can understand what he's saying at a high level, and then he's able to like make his life easier by putting in a little extra effort now, and then it's like saving a ton of extra effort later.
Have you noticed any overlap of other industries sort of coming into um, the tech space in terms of, like, for example, let's just say medicine, right? As diagnoses become more automated, do you see doctors becoming programmers? Do you think that that's a future that they learn medicine, but then they're actually coding rather than the possibly the patient treatment side?
I could see like some being like, oh, I want to make this a little easier. I want to make this a little more useful for doctors. And I think that's kind of the nice thing with, I guess I view tech as it's gonna kind of bleed into everything because if you can use it, it just saves you time and effort. And I think as the species, we really like that. We like being able to like not have to like do the hard thing over and over and over. So tech kind of helps like augment every other area. And I think as it does that, you have some of that like cross back and forth. So you have like a doctor who's like, okay, maybe he wants to take a crack at this. And because like as a on my end, it's like I just focus on like code. So I might not understand that it's like, oh, the doctor would really be beneficial if he had this aspect. But it's like on his end, he can like, make something, or she can be like, this is a requirement I have, and then wind up at a better thing than if either side made it alone.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think personally, I think that there's going to be a lot more crossover in the future, just
Hmm.
as things are, getting automated. I mean, accuracy wise of like maybe even a diagnostic tool, right? Taking in data from lab results rather than just visually reading through and using numbers, an
Yeah,
automated way may be better, right? So I think it'll be really interesting to see if in the next couple of years we start seeing medical students also doing a little bit of coding to sort of bridge that gap, and maybe there's advantages there.
yeah, I'd definitely say it's a positive to like know at least a little code enough. It helps with some logical thinking, and then it could just make life easier.
Yeah. Well, we've taken a lot of your time. Do you have any additional advice that we haven't touched upon about, you know, who would be interested in getting in this career, or just a broad, hey, everyone should learn a little bit of code type of advice?
Yeah, definitely everyone should learn a little bit of code, and I think part of the issue for some people is it looks daunting, but it's once you start getting into it, it's really not. And again, Google's like an amazing friend. Stack Overflow. It's I would not. I'd be lying if I say I still don't use it often. Where it's like, oh, okay, it's like let me check this, let me check this. Um, so it, don't feel like you have to know everything, or even like half of everything to like start dipping your toes in. And it's the little things are fun to make too, where it's like some of- some projects I really liked weren't necessarily like the most complicated, but like just the end product was like, okay, this is pretty sweet.
And just one last question to kind of piggyback off of what you just said. What are some tools? You said Stack Overflow. Are there any other websites that you would recommend for someone who wants to just dip their toe in?
Yes. So there's like the MDN docs kind of are for overall like internet stuff for front end, but the more useful one I'd say to start with is I want to say it's let me check. I think it's Web3. No, that's a entirely different thing. Um, ah, I forget. It's one of the. Let me check. Uh, W3 schools. That's what it is.
W3 schools. Okay.
So W3 schools does a pretty. It's a very like accessible version. Um, some people have complaints with it for they're like, okay, it's not all right, it's not like as kept up, but I think they've been improving um, over time, and it's a lot easier because they have their examples right there, and it's pretty user friendly.
Okay. Yeah. No, I appreciate that that tidbit at the end with all the resources. We'll make sure to try to list that on the video. Um, yeah, again, really appreciate all your time. For those watching, if you have any questions about a career in engineering, and then maybe even more specifically the front end engineer side, if you want to ask Mark any questions, you can feel free to reach out to us at info@mentoraccess.com, and we will relay the messages between um, you guys and Mark. So thanks again for being here, Mark. Really, really
Sure.
appreciate all the insight that you just provided.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun. I don't get to chat much about the journey, so
That's the point. All right, have a good one.
see ya.
Hey, thanks for joining us at Mentor Access. If you like what you just watched, please click like and subscribe, and also hit that bell so that you get notified when we have new videos come out. Thank you for supporting our mission.